The steppe begins in silence, a silence so wide it feels older than memory. Grass bends in long waves as if breathing with the earth, and the horizon stretches so far that even the sky seems unsure where it should end. In this vastness, sound travels differently, thought moves differently, and life grows according to rules written not by people, but by wind and weather. Before any empire rose, this land shaped the instincts of those who lived upon it, teaching them to read shifting shadows, distant cloud trails, and the faint tremor of hooves long before they appeared. Here, direction is learned without maps. A rider knows the angle of the sun by feel, and the pull of the seasons by the scent of frozen soil. Winters punish hesitation, summers reward movement. A person who cannot adapt simply disappears, and the land does not pause long enough to notice. The steppe sharpens those who endure, trimming away weakness until only resilience remains. Children grow up measuring distance with their bodies, learning balance before certainty. Horses move like extensions of thought, and survival becomes an instinct that settles deep into bone. Nothing here is wasted. Nothing here is stable. Everything depends on flow, wind over grass, herds across plains, and people following the rhythm of a world that refuses stillness. Civilizations beyond these borders built their strength on walls, grain, and stone. But the steppe trained its people through absence. No shelter, no boundaries, only the quiet demand to move or perish. In that demand, a different kind of human emerged. Alert, patient, and comfortable in spaces where others felt lost. Long before they became riders feared across continents, they were students of this silent teacher, shaped not by kings or armies but by cold nights, long distances, and the endless breath of the plains. And in this silence, something else formed, a sense that the world was meant to be crossed, not contained. The riders who would one day shake kingdoms grew beneath skies that offered no limits, only invitations. The steppe did not whisper ambition, it whispered inevitability. From this quiet, boundless world, a single childhood would rise, one shaped by hunger, exile, and an unforgiving horizon. It is from that horizon that the next chapter begins, where the silence of the land meets the silence inside a boy who learned to survive long before he learned to lead at all. Before the world learned the name Genghis, the land into which he was born was already carrying the weight of quiet devastation. The tribes of the steppe lived in a state of constant rearrangement, pulling apart and stitching together with the unpredictability of wind-blown grass. Alliances lasted only as long as convenience, promises dissolved in the same breath that made them, and every campfire flickered with the unspoken knowledge that friends could become enemies by morning. In this shifting landscape, security was an illusion, and loyalty was often a gamble paid in blood. Families moved not out of desire but necessity, chasing pasture, chasing safety, chasing the chance to survive one more season. Raids were not exceptional events. They were a language the tribes spoke fluently. Horses were taken, food stripped away, and lives redirected by the decisions of chiefs who themselves lived beneath the shadow of betrayal. Children grew up learning to listen for footsteps in the dark, to judge intent by tone alone, and to trust only what could be carried in their hands. Yet beneath this turbulence, something unexpected formed. Each tribe, forced to endure life as a fragile island, developed a talent for rapid decisions, for splitting into small groups without losing coordination, and for sensing danger long before it arrived. What appeared as chaos from the outside was, to those living within it, a training ground disguised as hardship. Every ambush survived, every sudden retreat, every shifting alliance sharpened instincts that settled deep into memory. The tribes were not noble in the romantic sense. They were shaped by scarcity, hardened by hunger, and guided by an understanding that survival depended on flexibility rather than strength. Their world had no central authority, no shared vision, no single banner to gather beneath. And yet, without knowing it, they were preparing themselves for the moment when someone would rise to bind these scattered fragments together. This broken landscape did not weaken the steppe, it refined it. It turned suspicion into awareness, instability into adaptability, and constant danger into a way of sensing opportunity. A world held together by nothing but fear and instinct was waiting for a mind capable of turning these fractured patterns into something unified. The fractured world demands a unifier, and from its shifting edges, a boy named Temüjin would soon begin to walk toward his destiny. Temüjin's childhood began with a silence far harsher than the silence of the plains. When his father died, the family was cast out, abandoned by those who once called themselves allies. Their tent was stripped, their protection revoked, and the world that should have sheltered a child instead pushed him toward the edge of death. Hunger lingered around him like a constant shadow. Days stretched into thin, aching hours, where each decision meant the difference between shrinking further into despair or enduring one more night of cold wind and empty hands. In this bleak solitude, Temüjin learned to watch people the way others watched the weather. He saw the flicker of hesitation before betrayal, the narrowed eyes that revealed concealed intentions, and the quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. Exile did not harden him through anger, it sharpened him through observation. As his family scraped together survival from roots, scraps, and luck, he came to understand how fragile loyalty could be, and how deeply fear shaped human choices. Captivity arrived like another winter. Taken by rivals and bound like an animal, Temüjin discovered a truth that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even in chains, the mind could move freely. He studied the habits of his captors, noted their patterns, and waited for the moment when their confidence would falter. His escape was not a display of strength, but of perception, a quiet slipping through the cracks created by carelessness. These early trials carved something unusual into him. While other boys dreamed of horses or glory, Temüjin learned the anatomy of vulnerability. He understood the loneliness hidden behind threats, the desperation behind cruelty, and the fear beneath bluster. Instead of breaking him, hardship taught him how people moved when they believed no one was watching. It made him patient, cautious, and aware in ways that would later unsettle the most powerful rulers on the continent. He grew not through triumph, but through endurance. Every betrayal taught him what loyalty should feel like. Every hunger taught him what abundance must be used for. Every night spent alone taught him the importance of those who would one day stand beside him. The boy who walked alone would not remain alone forever. And as he stepped out of childhood, thin and unyielding, the world would soon learn that the quiet resilience he forged in exile was the beginning of a force it could no longer contain. Temüjin's rise did not begin with seasoned warriors or noble clans. It began with the ones the world had already discarded. They came to him in ones and twos at first, runaways fleeing punishment, orphans who no longer remembered a home, men marked as traitors by chiefs, whose approval shifted like drifting sand. These were people who held no land, no titles, and no place to return to. Yet in their worn faces and guarded eyes, Temüjin recognized something familiar, a stubborn will to continue, even when everything else had been taken. He did not judge their pasts. He listened instead to the quiet hunger beneath their words, the kind he understood too well. Where other leaders saw danger in outcasts, Temüjin saw potential. These men had survived without protection. They had learned to move quietly, to think quickly, and to trust sparingly. And because they had nothing else, they gave what little they had with unusual clarity. Their effort, their presence, their belief that following him might lead somewhere other than the familiar edges of despair. Temüjin offered something no chief had ever offered them: loyalty that did not depend on blood, and respect that did not require pedigree. He rewarded courage, not lineage. He remembered promises, even small ones. He shared whatever food he had, dividing it evenly, rather than saving the richest cuts for himself. In a world where betrayal was ordinary, such fairness felt impossible. In a world where bloodlines dictated fate, he created a new kind of bond, loyalty that grew from trust, not obligation. Slowly, the outcasts became companions. Companions became brothers, and these brothers, bound together by hardship and choice rather than tradition, formed a unity stronger than that of any noble clan. Their pasts, painful, fractured, and unwanted, became the fuel that kept them moving. They fought not to protect a name, but to protect the rare loyalty they had finally found. In this unusual gathering, Temüjin discovered the shape of something larger than survival. He saw how strength could emerge from brokenness, how people discarded by society could become the spine of an empire. What settled tribes dismissed as weakness became his greatest advantage. From scattered men came a band, from a band came a tribe, and from that tribe, the first tremor of a storm began to rise across the steppe, one the world was not prepared to face. Long before the Mongols became a force recognized by distant cities, they learned to build power without leaving a trace. Their empire did not begin with walls or monuments, nor with a capital crowned by stone. It began with something far less visible, a framework of habits, loyalties, and decisions that could travel anywhere the wind carried them. To outsiders, it looked like chaos tribes shifting, leaders rising and falling, camps appearing on one horizon and vanishing on the next. But beneath that movement lay a quiet structure, a skeleton strong enough to hold an empire, yet flexible enough to disappear whenever danger approached. This invisible skeleton rested on principles, not buildings. Loyalty ran upward and downward in equal measure, binding men through trust rather than fear. Leadership came from competence, not bloodline, allowing the sharpest minds to climb quickly and the unreliable to fall away long before they caused harm. Information flowed through whispers on horseback, through scouts who sensed the land like migrating birds, and through messengers who crossed distances so quickly it seemed time itself bent around them. Decision-making was decentralized but coherent. Every group understood the larger mission without needing constant instruction. A single signal could split the army into fragments, each acting independently, yet moving with uncanny coordination. What appeared spontaneous was actually rehearsed by necessity. Life on the steppe demanded constant readiness, and that readiness became a political principle. Even in peace, they lived as though the next challenge waited just beyond the horizon. This skeletal design made the Mongols impossible to pin down. They could vanish from an approaching enemy, loop around unseen, and reappear days later when no one expected them. Without walls, they could not be besieged. Without a capital, they could not be decapitated. Without rigid borders, they could not be contained. Their empire existed wherever their horses stood, and shifted whenever they chose to move. The world around them relied on weight and permanence. The Mongols relied on motion and clarity. And it was this clarity, this invisible framework of discipline, adaptability, and mutual reliance that became the true backbone of their empire. From this structure, a new kind of strategy emerged, one where movement itself became a weapon, and the horizon was never a barrier, but an open gate waiting to be crossed. The Mongols understood motion not as a simple act of traveling, but as a discipline that shaped every decision they made. To them, movement was a language written across the earth itself, one that shifted with wind patterns, the color of shadows, and the quiet signals of animals drifting along the steppe. They read the world the way others read maps, but their reading required no parchment. Each sunrise offered new information. They watched the direction birds took when startled, how grass bent when a distant herd moved, and where the frost lingered longest after dawn. These clues created a living map that no empire of walls could match. Their true advantage was rhythm. They moved in cycles that mirrored the endurance of their horses, switching mounts before exhaustion set in, allowing the army to glide across impossible distances without slowing. While other armies marched as if bound to the ground beneath them, the Mongols traveled as if time bent in their favor. This mobility was not chaos. It was a science refined through centuries of survival. They knew how far a horse could run before its breath soured, how quickly temperature shifts signaled storms, and which routes would offer just enough water to keep momentum steady. Even darkness became an ally. They traveled under starlight with the confidence of sailors guided by constellations. Every rider carried several horses, creating a reservoir of endurance unmatched by any other military force. Armies that believed they had days or weeks to prepare found Mongol scouts on their borders before the alarm fully reached the city walls. Movement became a blade sharper than steel, cutting through distance, hesitation, and the illusion of safety. To understand their victories, one must first understand their speed, not the speed of panic, but the speed of intention. It was this mastery of motion, this quiet dominion over time and terrain, that allowed the Mongols to arrive long before anyone believed arrival was possible. Movement becomes strategy, and strategy becomes inevitability, as the world discovers battles were often won long before the first arrow flew. To face such an enemy meant confronting a force shaped by motion itself. They advanced like weather fronts, shifting direction smoothly without losing momentum. Each campaign unfolded with a tempo only they could sustain, bewildering slower foes. In this dance of distance, they learned to bend possibility into advantage again and again over time. Long before the Mongols loosed their first arrows, they sensed something else ahead of them, an emotion that traveled faster than any rider. Fear became their quiet herald, slipping into hearts long before hooves struck the earth. They understood, with unnerving clarity, how human minds fracture under the weight of uncertainty. A distant dust cloud, a whisper carried by traders, a single scout glimpsed on the horizon. Each small sign worked like a fracture spreading through stone. People filled the silence with their own nightmares. The Mongols learned how to shape those nightmares. They let rumors grow unchecked, allowed stories of vanished villages and impossible speed to drift across borders. They understood that a terrified imagination often crafted horrors far greater than any army could demonstrate. By the time they arrived, their enemies were already fighting shadows in their own minds. Their tactics deepened this unease. False retreats executed with perfect discipline taught opponents to question every apparent victory. Silent night marches left defenders unsure where the threat truly lay. Ambushes fell with such precision that survivors described them less as battles and more as awakenings into chaos. An army that cannot predict where danger comes from eventually assumes it is everywhere. To face the Mongols meant confronting not just warriors, but uncertainty itself. Their enemies watched the horizon with dread, unable to tell whether the dust rising in the distance belonged to a caravan or a force capable of erasing entire cities. Even when the Mongols were far away, the possibility of their presence hollowed courage from within. Leaders hesitated, scouts lost conviction, and soldiers began imagining disaster with every shifting shadow. Fear dismantled resistance more effectively than any weapon. Walls did not crumble from impact, they weakened when defenders believed holding them was futile. Armies broke ranks not from wounds, but from the suspicion that survival was impossible. Once fear took hold, the Mongols merely completed what anxiety had already begun. In understanding the architecture of terror, they learned how to fight enemies long before meeting them. Fear cleared pathways that steel alone never could. It softened cities, scattered armies, and turned confident rulers into cautious observers of their own downfall. And once fear had finished its work, another force stepped forward, one colder, sharper, and far more deliberate. The Mongols' mastery of information, the unseen network that made their arrival feel inevitable. Long before Mongol banners appeared on a horizon, their shadows were already there. Not the shadows of armies, but the quieter kind travelers who asked harmless questions, merchants who listened more than they spoke, and scouts who moved across the land like threads stitching distant regions together. The Mongols built an intelligence network so subtle that most civilizations never realized they had been studied until the studying was complete. Information, for them, was not a luxury. It was the first step of conquest. Their scouts traveled weeks or months ahead of the army, slipping through valleys, marketplaces, and border towns with the ease of wind crossing plain grass. They counted defenders, measured walls, noted water sources, and studied the temperament of rulers. They learned which towns feared the Mongols most, and which foolishly believed they were beyond reach. These details, gathered patiently and stored through memory rather than parchment, became the invisible maps guiding every advance. Merchants played their part without always knowing it. Their trade routes carried gossip faster than messengers could ride, and the Mongols listened to every rumor. A frightened whisper about a weak gate, a complaint about a greedy governor, a mention of a city divided by internal quarrels. Each scrap of information became a thread in a larger tapestry. The Mongols tugged these threads gently, waiting to see which ones unraveled an entire region. Their official messengers moved with astonishing speed, linking commanders across vast distances with updates that shifted strategy in real time. A decision made in the morning could reshape an entire campaign by nightfall. Enemies marched blind, the Mongols marched informed. To those who faced them, the effect felt supernatural. How could a nomadic people know terrain better than those who lived upon it? How could they approach cities they had never seen with the confidence of architects? The answer lay in this quiet web, a living network of watchers, listen not heirs, and pattern readers who mapped continents without needing ink. This intelligence formed the skeleton beneath every Mongol victory. It gave the illusion that the Mongols always appeared in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. And in truth, they did because they had already walked those places in silence. Information leads to precision, and precision becomes the force that makes conquest feel inevitable. The next chapter reveals how this knowledge turned movement, fear, and timing into the sharpest edge of all. Long before the Mongols gained their reputation as unstoppable riders, a quieter force shaped their destiny. It was small enough to rest across a forearm, light enough to draw from horseback, and powerful enough to unmake kingdoms. The composite bow did not roar like siege engines or shine like polished steel. It whispered. It bent with a grace that seemed almost alive, as if carrying the memory of all the creatures whose sinew and horn gave it form. In the hands of a Mongol rider, it became more than a weapon. It became an extension of breath and intention. Children learned its language before they understood the weight of responsibility. They practiced from the saddle while the horse moved beneath them, learning to release arrows not with deliberate thought, but with instinct shaped by hours in open grasslands where the horizon demanded precision. Shooting was not taught as an art. It was absorbed as naturally as learning to walk. Their bodies grew around the motion of drawing, anchoring, and releasing, until the bow felt less like a tool and more like a continuation of the arm itself. Crafted from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, the bow stored an enormous amount of energy in its curved frame. Civilizations, protected by stone walls and armored ranks, believed distance kept them safe. Yet Mongol arrows arrived from beyond what seemed possible, falling with a force that shocked defenders who thought themselves beyond reach. The bow remained light, flexible, and deceptively simple, hiding its complexity behind a shape that appeared almost fragile. It was not fragile. It was a living contradiction, delicate in appearance, devastating in practice. The steppe shaped it just as it shaped the people who carried it, giving it resilience where others saw fragility, and silence where others expected noise. In battle, the whisper of its string carried more dread than the clash of metal. Arrows flew in arcs that felt almost preordained, finding gaps in armor, slipping through narrow shield openings, and striking from angles city-bound armies never trained to defend against. For the Mongols, the bow defined rhythm, distance, and timing. It dictated how close they approached, when they retreated, and how they circled their enemies with choreographed precision. And from the bow in their hands, attention now shifts to the riders themselves, the moving force that transformed silent arrows into storms. To understand the Mongols, one must first understand the creatures that carried them. Their horses were not grand or imposing, not the towering steeds celebrated in royal paintings. They were small, sturdy, and unassuming animals, shaped by the same winds and winters that sculpted the riders themselves. Yet these humble creatures held an endurance that bordered on the supernatural. They could survive on frostbitten grass, travel through storms that froze lesser animals in their tracks, and run long after exhaustion should have claimed them. From the earliest years of childhood, Mongols learned the world from the saddle. A child was placed on a horse almost as soon as he could stand, his balance trained not by instruction, but by the natural rhythm of movement across open plains. Riding became instinct, a motion felt before it was understood. The steppe taught them that the ground was for camps and brief rests. Life, in its fullest form, unfolded while in motion. Each warrior carried several mounts, rotating them as if tending to a living network of energy. While one horse breathed heavily, another stepped forward, ready to absorb the next stretch of distance. This system allowed entire armies to move with a tempo no settled force could imitate. Where other soldiers camped to recover, the Mongols continued forward, refreshed by the relentless endurance of their companions. The bond between rider and horse extended beyond practicality. Horses learned their riders' weight, voice, and shifting intentions. They responded to subtle leg pressure, slight movements of the reins, and the near-silent cues that passed between beings shaped by the same unforgiving land. In battle, a Mongol horse could pivot, sprint, or retreat with a synchronicity that seemed telepathic, allowing the rider to release arrows while turning, or to draw another bowstring without losing speed. The world saw these horses as unimpressive, unaware that their modest size hid centuries of adaptation. They were built not for show, but for survival creatures whose endurance created the platform for conquest. And because the Mongols lived so deeply entwined with them, the two became one moving force, a fusion of instincts and wills. With riders bonded to their mounts and bows that reached across impossible distances, the next step emerges naturally, the formations and patterns that turned this mobility into a devastating, world-shifting weapon. To the outside world, the Mongol army looked like a storm without structure, fast, scattered, unpredictable. But beneath that swirling surface lay an elegant design so simple that most commanders overlooked its brilliance. It began with tens, then hundreds, then thousands, each unit layered atop the next like rings in a living organism. This was the Temüjin system, a formation that seemed too flexible, too loose, too fluid to ever hold its shape in battle. Yet it did, again and again, reshaping the fate of nations. Each group moved as though guided by instinct rather than orders shouted across the wind. 100 could break away from 1,000 without losing connection. 1,000 could fragment into smaller knots without becoming lost. The structure breathed contracting when threatened, expanding when opportunity appeared, coiling around enemies like a silent predator circling prey. There was no cumbersome hierarchy slowing decisions, no rigid chain of command that cracked under pressure. Every unit understood the whole, and the whole trusted each unit to sense its role. This strange symmetry mirrored the hunting patterns of steppe wolves. Packs spread wide, feint, retreat, lure the target forward, then converge with perfect timing. To armies accustomed to fixed lines and predictable maneuvers, the Mongols seemed wild, disorganized, almost careless. But what appeared chaotic was actually a pattern older than civilization. The steppe had taught its inhabitants to survive by flowing, not by standing firm. On the battlefield, this meant the Mongols could vanish within moments, only to reappear on a different flank. They could surround opponents before the enemy even realized the danger. They could stretch their lines so thin that they looked vulnerable, then collapse inward like a trap snapping shut. Their movements were not mechanical. They were instinctual, shaped by generations who lived by reading the land rather than maps. For opponents, the experience felt like fighting smoke no matter where they struck. The Mongols simply shifted, recombined, and returned with sharpened purpose. Victory seemed possible until the moment it wasn't, until the formation tightened with sudden precision, and the battlefield shifted in their favor. With formation and movement now entwined, another layer of their strategy emerges, one so unexpected and deceptively simple that it transformed uncertainty into a weapon. The next section reveals the strange tool that made the Mongols even harder to predict. Long before steel clashed and arrows darkened the air, the Mongols prepared a different kind of battlefield, one shaped by illusion. They understood that confusion could break a formation faster than any blade, and that an enemy who could not see clearly could not think clearly. So they carried tools that seemed almost primitive: pots of thick smoke, bundles that crackled like distant thunder, and incendiary mixtures that crawled across dry grass in unpredictable patterns. To outsiders, these objects looked insignificant. On the battlefield, they became something far more unsettling. A single smoke pot could turn a clear valley into a drifting maze. Dense clouds rolled low, twisting into strange shapes that made riders look multiplied, towering, or ghost-like. Shadows flickered in the haze, making defenders unsure whether one horse approached or 20. In that suspended moment of doubt, fear seeped into the cracks of discipline. Sound followed. The Mongols unleashed rattles, drums, and whistling devices that mimicked the arrival of far larger forces. Echoes bounced across rock and open plain, creating the illusion of armies where none stood. Commanders who once trusted their eyes and ears found both betraying them, feeding the rising sense that the Mongols were everywhere at once. Then came fire, small sparks carried on arrows or scattered through brittle grasses. Flames ran in thin, snaking lines, dancing unpredictably as wind lifted them toward mounted silhouettes. To defenders, the scene felt dreamlike and disorienting, as if the earth itself had begun to glow and shift beneath their feet. Fire did not need to consume. It only needed to move erratically, drawing attention in the wrong direction, while Mongol riders closed in from another. What made these tactics so terrifying was not their complexity, but their timing. Confusion arrived first, softening the mind. Doubt followed, hollowing courage from within. And only then did the Mongols strike swift, precise, and seemingly emerging from nothing. Armies accustomed to clear lines and predictable maneuvers found themselves overwhelmed before they had even seen their attackers properly. To face the Mongols was to face a battlefield that refused to behave. Smoke hid truth, sound distorted scale, and fire turned familiar ground into shifting danger. And when defenders finally regained clarity, it was often too late. From these eerie tricks, we now follow the storm as it grows larger and darker, rolling toward the walls of cities that once believed themselves unassailable. Cities expected war to announce itself with sound, marching feet, clashing metal, the rising hum of panic that usually precedes disaster. But when the Mongols approached, the first sign was the absence of signs. No drums, no shouts, no restless movement. Only a stillness that settled over the landscape like a held breath. Scouts arrived first, drifting along the edges of sight, circling walls with the patience of hawks studying prey from above. They did not provoke. They did not rush. They simply watched. From the towers, defenders squinted into the distance, unsure whether they were seeing riders or tricks of light along the horizon. The scouts moved quietly, mapping every weakness, an unguarded postern gate, a collapsed portion of wall, a water source just beyond the city's reach. They counted the guards, noted when torches dimmed, and traced the rhythm of daily life inside the walls. Their purpose was not to threaten but to understand, and that understanding became the first crack in the city's sense of safety. As days passed, the silence deepened. Rumors traveled faster than certainty. People whispered about shadows shifting behind dunes, about riders who seemed to disappear the moment anyone tried to count them. Even the animals sensed something unnatural in the air. Dogs barked toward empty fields, and horses grew nervous without knowing why. The Mongols' greatest tactic in these early moments was restraint. They let the city fill the void with its own fears. Inside the walls, tension thickened. Leaders debated whether to prepare for siege or attempt negotiation, but the absence of visible threat made every decision feel premature. What unsettled them most was the feeling of being observed, every weakness exposed to eyes they could not see. Soldiers paced the battlements, trying to pierce the horizon, while the population below shifted between denial and dread. Only when the city's defenses began to strain under the weight of uncertainty did the Mongols slowly tighten their ring. Camps appeared miles away, positioned with mathematical precision. Fires burned evenly spaced, signaling organization rather than haste. Still, no attack came. The storm continued to gather in complete quiet, as if waiting for the moment when the city's confidence softened enough to tear. In this unnerving lull, the stage was set. Silence had done its work, hollowing certainty from the inside. And from that silence, the next phase would rise the moment when precision replaced stillness, and Siegecraft finally revealed the storm behind the calm. When people imagine the Mongols, they picture riders sweeping across open plains, not engineers crouched beside intricate machines. Yet, the fall of cities across Asia and Europe revealed a quieter truth. The Mongols mastered siegecraft with a precision that felt almost unnatural. They did not invent every tool they used. Instead, they gathered knowledge the way others gathered treasures piece by piece, culture by culture, folding foreign brilliance into their growing arsenal. From China, they learned heavy catapults. From Persia, the art of mining walls. From captured engineers, the mathematics of range and weight. Every technique, no matter its origin, became part of their evolving science. To defenders, it felt impossible that nomads could wield such machines with competence. But the Mongols approached siegecraft with the same adaptability that defined their movement. They watched, learned, and replicated. Engineers taken alive were treated not as prisoners but as assets, fed well and placed under guard until their expertise had been absorbed. With each new conquest, their understanding deepened. Soon they commanded trebuchets capable of launching stones heavy enough to reduce towers to rubble, and incendiary weapons that scattered fire across rooftops like glowing seeds carried by the wind. What made their siegecraft terrifying was not the machines themselves, but the speed with which they deployed them. Cities expecting months of preparation found engines assembled in days. Walls thought unbreakable shuddered under relentless strikes. Even defenders who believed themselves beyond reach discovered Mongol sappers digging quietly beneath foundations, setting charges or collapsing tunnels with unsettling accuracy. Once the Mongols committed to a siege, the city's fate shifted from uncertain to scheduled. They also understood psychology. A few demonstrations of overwhelming force stones crashing into marketplaces, firepots exploding over crowded rooftops, sent fear rippling through civilian populations. Panic weakened resolve long before the walls fell. The Mongols used this fear with careful intention, showing just enough destruction to hint at catastrophe, while leaving room for negotiation. Their message was clear: surrender now, or face the full science of their collected knowledge. Every tool, every technique, every fragment of foreign wisdom fused into a single, devastating capacity, an empire that conquered not through invention, but through absorption. And once the engines roared to life, the city's leaders were confronted with a choice older than war itself. From these machines of force and fear, the next phase emerges the mechanism of surrender, where decisions made behind trembling walls determine the fate of thousands. When the Mongols encircled a city, they did not begin with destruction. They began with choice. A messenger would approach the gates unarmed, composed, carrying the weight of a simple decree that had already reshaped continents. The message came in 3 offers, each as sharp as an arrowhead and as deliberate as a blade laid on a table. The first offer was surrender. Open the gates, offer tribute, accept Mongol rule, and live. Life would continue, though under a new sky. The second option was resistance, fight, and face the certainty of annihilation. The third was flight. Abandon the city, run into the plains, and be hunted until exhaustion delivered the final verdict. These were not choices in the usual sense. They were mirrors. Each one reflected the city's fears, its pride, its ability to recognize the shifting currents of fate. Surrender meant swallowing honor to preserve existence. Resistance meant clinging to identity despite the cost. Flight meant admitting hopelessness, hoping the steppe might hide what walls could not protect. Every city believed itself different. Every ruler thought he possessed clarity. But the Mongols knew that human nature collapsed along predictable lines when pressed between survival and pride. Inside the walls, debates swelled. Soldiers argued for defiance. Merchants whispered about opening the gates before trade vanished forever, and peasants prayed to gods who had gone silent beneath the looming threat. Leaders weighed consequences that stretched beyond themselves. Some convinced themselves they could win. Others believed surrender would stain their names for generations. And still others hesitated, until hesitation itself became their downfall. The Mongols waited. Silence was their ally. They watched torches shift along ramparts, listened to distant arguments drifting across night air, and observed how quickly discipline frayed when fear pooled in the streets. Countless cities surrendered without a single arrow fired, undone not by force but by the collapsing geometry of their own decisions. It was never only siegecraft that conquered them. It was the way human minds fracture when cornered by inevitability. Those who resisted learned the harsh truth behind their choice. Those who fled discovered the futility of running from riders who treated distance like a trivial obstacle. And those who surrendered found themselves standing at the edge of a different paradox: mercy from a force known for flames. For when gates finally opened, the next chapter revealed a moral puzzle. The world still struggles to understand the dual nature of Mongol rule, where fire and mercy shared the same breath. When a city opened its gates to the Mongols, something unexpected often followed. Instead of immediate devastation, the conquerors imposed order with a calmness that unsettled those who expected blood. Markets reopened within days. Roads were cleared. Caravan routes long haunted by bandits became safe enough for merchants to sleep without fear. Taxes were predictable, recorded with careful accuracy. Even religious groups found themselves protected rather than suppressed. For many, life under Mongol rule became strangely stable, as though the storm that threatened destruction had instead swept away corruption, lawlessness, and uncertainty. But beneath this stability lay the memory of fire. The Mongols did not hide their capacity for annihilation. They displayed it sparingly, choosing moments that would echo across generations. A city that resisted would be erased with methodical intensity, its fate retold in whispers along every trade route. These stories traveled farther than armies, reminding distant rulers that obedience preserved life while defiance ensured ruin. Mercy and brutality were not contradictions, they were two halves of a single system designed to make resistance unthinkable. The Mongols understood a truth many empires ignored. Fear alone creates rebellion, but fear paired with fairness creates obedience. Once a region surrendered, officials were often reinstated, provided they cooperated. Farmers returned to their fields. Craftsmen continued their trades. The empire did not thrive on endless warfare. It thrived on the reliable flow of goods, information, and tribute. Peace, once established, became profitable. And because the people remembered what defiance cost their neighbors, that peace was rarely disturbed. This paradox defined Mongol rule. They burned cities not out of mindless cruelty, but to craft a reputation sharp enough to travel faster than their horses. At the same time, they nurtured the lands that accepted their authority, ensuring prosperity that made rebellion irrational. Power, for them, was a balance between terror and stability, each reinforcing the other. Travelers who crossed the empire marveled at roads safer than any guarded by kings. Scholars found the freedom to practice beliefs suppressed in their homelands. Merchants reached distant markets without negotiating countless tolls, yet none of them forgot the stories of the cities that had vanished. From these conquered regions held steady by mercy, memory, and the lingering scent of smoke, we now move deeper into the machinery behind it all, the invisible systems that governed the world's largest empire at its peak. Most empires anchored their power in stone. They built capitals to declare permanence, palaces to display authority, and courts to gather the machinery of rule in one fixed place. But the Mongol Empire broke this pattern entirely. Its power did not sit atop a throne or behind a grand gate. It moved. Decisions were made in tents that shifted with the seasons, carried across steppes by riders who understood that stillness was the first step toward decline. What looked like instability to outsiders was, in truth, a deliberate design, an empire ruled through motion rather than walls. At the center of this design stood the Khan, whose authority reached across continents even as his camp migrated from pasture to pasture. Loyalty flowed toward him not because of geography, but because of trust. Trust earned through shared hardships, clear commands, and rewards given without favoritism. Governors were rotated like shifting pieces on a living board, preventing any region from turning into a fiefdom of its own ambition. No official could grow too comfortable, and no province could drift beyond oversight. This decentralization puzzled foreign observers. How could a government function when its heart refused to stay in one place? Yet the Mongols thrived precisely because they were unbound. Communication lines moved with them, supply routes adjusted effortlessly, and the flow of power stayed responsive to changing conditions. With no capital to besiege, enemies found themselves striking at shadows. The empire's administrative core was everywhere and nowhere at once. The Khan's his felt tent, became the closest thing to a throne room, yet it could be dismantled in minutes and rebuilt on a new hillside before the sun reached its highest point. Inside, decisions affecting millions were made, with the same calm simplicity found in any Mongol household. Maps unfurled on carpets, emissaries waited beside firelight, and messages arrived carried by riders who crossed vast distances as if the land itself had shrunk beneath their hooves. This mobility was not a weakness. It was the secret that kept the empire alert, adaptable, and impossible to corner. A moving mind governed a moving world, shaping a structure that defied every expectation of imperial rule. With power flowing freely across the land, the next question becomes inevitable. How did messages travel with such speed across an empire too large to grasp? To understand that, we follow the riders who stitched this vast world together. Across the vastness of the Mongol world, messages travelled with a speed that seemed to ignore distance itself. The steppe was wide enough to swallow kingdoms, yet a single decision made in the Khan's tent could ripple across thousands of miles before night fully settled. This miracle of movement came from the yam, the relay system that turned the empire into something alive, a body with nerves stretching from one horizon to the other. Riders carried its thoughts, horses carried its pulse, and the land became a network through which time itself flowed. Stations were placed along routes like beads on an endless thread. Each held fresh mounts, supplies, and shelter for the riders who raced through wind and weather without stopping to rest. A courier could arrive breathless, leap from the saddle, hand over a sealed message, and watch the next rider vanish into the distance within moments. The transition was seamless, as if the message never paused at all, only shifted bodies while keeping its momentum. Travelers described the sensation of standing beside a yam route as uncanny, a sudden thunder of hooves approaching from nothing, a blur of movement flashing past, and then silence returning as if the land had merely exhaled. These couriers moved with the urgency of storms, crossing deserts, forests, and mountain passes with a singular purpose: to keep the empire connected, informed, and awake. Governors who thought distance might shield their decisions learned otherwise. Auditors arrived with unsettling speed. Orders from the Khan reached frontier towns before rumors could distort them. Armies adjusted positions in days rather than months, striking before rebellions gathered strength. To rule such a sprawling world required more than strength. It required omnipresence. And through the Yam, the Mongol Empire achieved something close to that impossible state. The riders themselves became symbols, figures who seemed half mythical, part human and part wind. They carried intelligence, warnings, commands, and sometimes a single line, capable of shifting the balance of entire regions. Their existence made borders feel temporary, and geography feel negotiable. Information, carried at this pace, became a weapon equal to cavalry or siege engines. It allowed the empire to see with many eyes and react with a speed that no rival could match. With communication secured and distance conquered, another question rises from the calm. How did the Mongols ensure that the world they governed obeyed the rules flowing through this invisible network? In most empires, law lived inside heavy books or carved stone tablets. But in the Mongol world, law drifted through memory like a whispered current. The Yasa, often spoken of with awe, was not a codified set of commandments preserved in ink. It existed instead as a living presence, an oral agreement carried from camp to camp, held in the minds of generals, elders, and riders who had sworn themselves to the Khan. It was law written not on parchment, but on the wind that moved across the steppe. No one could point to a single scroll that contained the entirety of the Yasa, yet everyone understood its weight. It guided behavior with a clarity that made written systems seem clumsy. Disputes were settled through precedent, remembered by those entrusted with its keeping. Punishments were swift but predictable, rooted in principles that valued loyalty, discipline, and communal survival above all else. The Yasa demanded honesty, protected envoys, punished theft harshly, and insisted that leaders serve as examples rather than exceptions. Its power came from belief. Warriors obeyed because the Yasa felt sacred, an inheritance from Genghis Khan himself, shaped by the hardships that forged the empire. They feared violating it not only because of consequences, but because doing so meant stepping outside a shared identity held together by trust. Even governors ruling distant regions abided by its expectations, understanding that the Khan's reach extended further than geography suggested. Legends whispered that the Yasa could not be broken, even by those closest to the throne. Stories told of princes punished for theft, of commanders demoted for arrogance, of relatives of the Khan himself forced to submit to its judgment. Whether every tale was true mattered less than the atmosphere they created. The law's mystique became its enforcement. It existed everywhere, without needing to be written anywhere. To conquered peoples, this invisible structure brought an unexpected stability. They discovered that Mongol justice, though strict, was consistent. Unlike many empires where rulers bent rules to convenience, the Mongols treated law as something the entire world stepped beneath. A governor who abused power risked not only rebellion, but the wrath of a system larger than any individual. From this unseen law carried across the empire like a shared breath, we moved to the deeper force that bound people more tightly than rules ever could, the loyalty that became the true currency of Mongol power. In the Mongol world, power did not rest on walls or gold, but on something far more fragile and far more enduring: loyalty. It was the quiet thread woven through every decision, every promotion, every victory. Genghis Khan understood early that strength meant little without trust, and trust meant little without fairness. So he reshaped the steppe's chaotic culture into a system where loyalty was earned, not assumed. Men who proved themselves regardless of lineage rose with startling speed, while those who betrayed their oaths fell swiftly, no matter how noble their blood. This meritocratic approach drew people from every corner of the empire. Persians versed in administration, Chinese scholars skilled in record-keeping, Turks trained in diplomacy, all found places of influence within Mongol governance. Talent mattered more than ancestry. The Khan rewarded faithfulness with land, wealth, and security that many had never imagined. Those who served well discovered a kind of upward mobility rare in the medieval world. In return, they pledged loyalty not out of fear alone, but out of genuine opportunity. Punishment for betrayal, however, was unforgiving. The Mongols treated treachery as a disease that needed immediate removal to preserve the whole. A commander who turned against his lord, a governor who stole taxes, a noble who plotted in secret all faced consequences that echoed across the empire. These moments of ruthless clarity reinforced the message that loyalty was the foundation on which everything stood. This balance of reward and punishment created a stability foreign observers struggled to understand. People from conquered lands found themselves respected if they proved capable. Families once oppressed by local nobility discovered that Mongol rule, harsh as it could be, allowed the diligent to rise. The empire became a mosaic of cultures, held together not by forced assimilation, but by shared participation in a system that recognized effort. Loyalty in the Mongol Empire was not demanded at sword point. It was engineered through opportunity. It extended beyond ethnicity, religion, and previous allegiance. Those who committed themselves were bound not only to the Khan, but to a vast network of individuals whose survival depended on mutual trust. With loyalty established as the empire's silent glue, the groundwork for something larger emerged. Control was secured, stability achieved, and with these foundations in place, the Mongols were ready for something far greater, reshaping the world beyond their own horizons. Long before the Mongols rose to power, the Silk Road stretched across continents like a fragile thread, frayed by bandits, fractured by rival kingdoms, and often closed by fear. Merchants travelled with caution, never sure if the next valley held opportunity or ambush. But under Mongol rule, something remarkable happened. The ancient routes, once broken into isolated segments, fused into a single flowing artery of movement. What had been a scattered network became, almost overnight, a living pathway of exchange, secure, predictable, and strangely peaceful. Caravans that once moved in tight clusters began to stretch out with confidence, their bells chiming softly across open plains. Fires glowed in desert rest stops where travelers shared stories without worrying about midnight raids. Envoys rode under clear night skies, crossing lands that had once been divided by suspicion, but were now united beneath a single authority. Borders blurred, tolls disappeared, and the long silence between regions faded into a steady hum of traffic. This transformation was not born from kindness. It was strategy. The Mongols understood that wealth flowed most easily through open channels, and information travelled safest along guarded roads. So they built a system where thieves were hunted relentlessly, corrupt officials punished, and merchants treated with respect. The empire realized that prosperity for traders meant prosperity for everyone, including itself. Along these reborn routes, goods travelled farther than ever. Silk from China, spices from India, glass from Persia, furs from the northern forests. Ideas travelled too, religions, scientific knowledge, languages, and rumours carried by the same winds that guided caravans. The world began to feel smaller, not because distances shortened, but because danger receded. Travellers remarked on the uncanny sense of ease. A merchant could cross thousands of miles without negotiating bribes or fearing betrayal at mountain passes. A scholar could journey from one court to another, learning from distant cultures as though wandering through neighbouring towns. Even envoys from Europe, shocked by the efficiency they encountered, described Mongol lands as a place where movement flowed without friction. Under this stability, the Silk Roads became more than trade routes. They transformed into the empire's circulatory system, pumping wealth, knowledge, and cooperation across continents. The quiet machine behind this rebirth revealed the Mongols' deeper ambition, not just to rule land, but to connect worlds. And with trade flowing freely, the next question emerged naturally. How did an empire of riders come to understand the world well enough to redraw it? The answer lies in their obsession with mapping the earth itself. Long before Mongol armies crossed continents, Mongol minds learned to picture them. The Khans collected maps the way others collected jewels, carefully, obsessively, piece by piece. From Persia came intricate diagrams of trade routes. From China, detailed records of rivers and mountain passes. From the Islamic world, astronomical charts. From Europe, crude sketches of distant coasts whispered about but rarely seen. Each map became a fragment of a larger mosaic, a growing portrait of the world the Khans intended not only to reach, but to understand. In dimly lit tents, scholars, envoys, and captured cartographers sat together, unrolling parchment that smelled of dust and travel. Lines were compared, corrected, and redrawn until separate worlds began to merge. The Mongols were not merely gathering geography, they were building a world mind, a mental tapestry in which distance, culture, and terrain intertwined. To them, maps were not static references but living instruments, shifting with new discoveries and expanding as far as riders dared to venture. This understanding gave their campaigns an uncanny precision. They knew where rivers narrowed, where valleys funneled armies, where deserts could be crossed with careful timing, and where cities were positioned like beads on a thread. Roads that had once seemed disconnected suddenly formed patterns. Routes that local kingdoms guarded jealously became transparent when placed beside their neighbors' secrecy. The Mongols saw connections others could not see, threads that linked empires which believed themselves separate. A map in the hands of a Khan became more than guidance. It became prophecy. It revealed vulnerabilities, opportunities, and ambitions. It allowed the Mongols to imagine paths no one had attempted to reach, lands whose names drifted across the steppe like distant myths. This vision was not arrogance, it was preparation. By understanding the world as a single, interconnected body, conquest became less a series of battles and more a movement through an already familiar landscape. Travelers who visited the Mongol court often remarked on this strange cartographic hunger. They encountered rulers who spoke of cities they had never seen with the confidence of locals, and who referenced distant rivers as if they had grown up fishing along their banks. Knowledge, to the Khans, was a form of ownership long before a single arrow flew. From these maps, these quiet blueprints of ambition, came the next impulse: to push past known borders, to test the edges of possibility, and to continue moving toward lands where even their vision blurred. There was a moment when it seemed the Mongols might consume the entire world. Their armies had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and shattered kingdoms that once believed themselves untouchable. Europe trembled as Mongol scouts reached its borders, their movements so swift that kings struggled to understand how far the threat had come. Japan watched strange sails appear on the horizon. Southeast Asia felt the tremor of armies advancing through jungles thick enough to swallow sound. And in every direction, it seemed nothing could slow the riders, who treated distance like an inconvenience, and geography like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Yet something unexpected happened. The momentum faltered not because the Mongols met an enemy stronger than themselves, but because the world itself began to resist. In Europe, a chain of events halted their advance, just as the continent braced for catastrophe. The great Khan Ögedei died, and tradition demanded all commanders return home to choose a successor. Armies poised to surge across river valleys and into medieval kingdoms suddenly turned back, leaving Europe suspended between relief and the eerie sense of having narrowly escaped a different future. In Japan, it was the sea that intervened. Twice the Mongols launched fleets toward the islands, and twice storms rose with devastating precision. The typhoons were later called divine winds, though to the Mongols they felt like the sky itself tearing apart their ambitions. Ships splintered, soldiers drowned. A conquest planned with confidence dissolved into scattered debris carried by the tides. In Southeast Asia, it was the land that pushed back. Dense jungles swallowed horses, humidity corroded weapons, drained stamina, and sickened riders unaccustomed to such oppressive heat. Terrain slowed their rhythm, disease thinned their ranks, and the familiar tempo of Mongol motion fractured beneath unfamiliar shadows. These halts were not failures in the traditional sense. They were reminders that even the greatest war machine depended on conditions it could not fully control. Nature, coincidence, tradition, forces that no strategy could silence interrupted campaigns that seemed unstoppable. The world that had yielded so easily in other regions suddenly hardened, as if reminding the Mongols that conquest had limits. And yet, these unfinished campaigns reveal something deeper. The Mongols' true strength did not lie in victories alone, but in recognizing when to withdraw, regroup, and adapt. From the edges of these halted ambitions, we move toward the core truth that sustained them, a secret woven not into triumph, but into survival itself. For all their reputation as destroyers, the Mongols possessed a quieter talent that shaped their empire far more than any battle. They adapted. Wherever they rode, they absorbed the world around them with an openness uncommon in conquering powers. They adopted Chinese systems of taxation and record-keeping, recognizing the strength of a bureaucracy that could harness millions. They embraced Persian astronomy, learning from scholars who mapped the heavens with patient precision. They incorporated Islamic administrative methods, weaving diverse traditions into a unified, practical framework. The Mongol Empire became a living structure, one that expanded by learning rather than by imposing. This adaptability made them unpredictable. A conquered region soon found its customs echoed in the new administration, not erased. Local officials were often kept in their positions, provided they served honestly. Technologies captured in war were quickly integrated into Mongol strategy. Knowledge flowed upward, informing decisions made thousands of miles away. The empire evolved not through force alone, but through synthesis, absorbing strengths wherever they were found. Yet beneath this flexibility lay a paradox. The more the Mongols adapted, the more differentiated their vast territories became. In China, Mongol rulers embraced court rituals and adopted styles of governance that felt unmistakably Chinese. In Persia, Mongol elites absorbed Islamic culture so deeply that their values diverged from their kin on the steppe. In Russia, Mongol influence fused with Slavic traditions, producing something entirely its own. What had once been a single, unified force began to feel like a constellation of worlds loosely connected by memory and allegiance. This fragmentation was not immediate, nor was it dramatic. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, as each region grew more confident in its own identity. The empire that once spoke with a single voice began to echo with many. Adaptation had allowed the Mongols to rule vast, culturally diverse lands, but it also planted seeds that would one day pull those lands apart. Strength had become vulnerability. Flexibility, once their advantage, made unity fragile. And as the centuries passed, the force that conquered continents began to dissolve into the very cultures it had absorbed. From this subtle shift, the empire softening along its edges, we move toward a deeper unraveling. Adaptation begins to fracture unity, and in the widening cracks, new destinies take shape. When Genghis Khan died, the world did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it fell into a strange, heavy quiet, like the moment after a great storm passes, when the air still trembles with memory. No enemy had defeated him. No rebellion had shattered the empire he built. Yet the moment his breath left the earth, the Mongols faced a challenge far more delicate than conquest: the question of inheritance. Their tradition did not allow a single heir to rule everything. Instead, power was divided among his descendants, forming 4 great khanates that stretched across continents like the ribs of a giant creature beginning to loosen. This division was not born from betrayal. It came from loyalty to bloodlines, customs, and the deep-rooted belief that each son deserved his own place in the world their father had shaped. But beneath this devotion lay a quiet tension. The empire had grown too vast, its rhythms too varied, its cultures too numerous to be held by one throne. Splitting it seemed sensible, almost necessary. And yet, with every region handed to a different branch of the family, the threads that once bound the Mongols into a single, unstoppable storm began to loosen. The sons and grandsons of Genghis carried his ambition, but not always his unity. Rivalries whispered beneath the surface, subtle at first, then sharper as each khanate found its own identity. Administrators loyal to one branch clashed quietly with those loyal to another. Borders that once felt invisible became markers of belonging. Decisions made in Karakorum did not always resonate in Persia or the Russian steppes. The empire had not broken, but it had shifted its weight, redistributing in ways that would leave lasting cracks. This moment marked the beginning of a slow unraveling woven into the fabric of Mongol culture itself. Their strength had always come from motion, unity, and shared purpose. Now the world they ruled moved in 4 directions at once, drifting apart like continents once fused beneath a single sky. And yet, this division was only the first step. From the settling dust rose the personalities who would shape the new era. Men whose ambitions, loyalties, and visions would push the empire toward its next transformations, for better or worse. Ögedei, the 3rd son of Genghis Khan, inherited an empire still echoing with the hoofbeats of conquest. Yet he approached rule with a gentler rhythm, as if he believed the world needed rebuilding more than it needed breaking. His voice lacked the harsh edge of his father's commands, and his temperament held a warmth that made people speak to him with surprising ease. Under his hand, the Mongol Empire entered a strange era of expansion wrapped in calm, a time when cities surrendered not only from fear, but from the promise of stability. He built where others destroyed. Karakorum rose from the dust, a capital unlike any the steppe had ever seen, a place where artisans from conquered lands shaped stone and metal into forms that carried whispers of Persia, China, and the Islamic world. Roads were repaired, relay stations strengthened, and reforms introduced that smoothed the flow of trade. For a moment, it seemed the empire might settle into something enduring. a vast organism breathing in steady, controlled measures. But Ögedei carried a burden the world could not see. Beneath his achievements pulsed an appetite that grew year by year, a thirst that blurred time and dulled clarity. He drank heavily, often beginning at dawn and ending when stars shimmered above the plains. Courtiers learned to navigate his moods with caution, knowing brilliance could emerge from one cup and ruin from the next. His excess did not erupt dramatically. It seeped quietly into the court, softening resolve, slowing decisions, loosening the discipline that had once defined Mongol rule. Still, his ambition moved outward. Under Ögedei, the Mongols pushed deeper into Eastern Europe, reaching as far as the edges of Vienna. Victories piled high, yet the emperor who commanded them drifted ever further into indulgence. Advisors whispered warnings, generals pleaded for restraint, but the man who had stabilized an empire could not stabilize himself. His body, worn by years of drinking, began to fracture long before his authority did. When Ögedei died, the empire paused as if holding its breath. His reign had been one of growth and quiet decay, triumph shadowed by personal unraveling. He left behind a world larger than the one he inherited, yet more fragile. From Ögedei's calm brilliance and consuming habit, the story shifts toward a different kind of ruler, one forged not by indulgence, but by sharp, unyielding intelligence. Möngke, the Khan who approached power with colder purpose. Möngke, grandson of Genghis Khan, stepped into power with none of Ögedei's warmth and none of the theatrical fury of other Mongol rulers. He carried himself with a steady, almost unsettling restraint, like a man who believed emotion was a distraction and clarity the only true currency of rule. Where others sought glory on the battlefield, Möngke sought order. And in an empire stretched across deserts, mountains, forests, and oceans, order had become a rare and brittle thing. His first acts were not conquests, but audits. He summoned governors, generals, and officials, stripping away titles from those who had grown complacent behind the shield of lineage. Corruption, which had begun to seep into the empire like slow-moving rot, was dragged into the light. Taxes were standardized, luxury was curtailed. Administrators who had used distance to hide their excesses found themselves exposed by a Khan who saw the empire not as a trophy, but as an equation in desperate need of balance. Möngke did not charm, he corrected. He did not inspire, he stabilized. Under his guidance, roads were repaired, supply chains tightened, and communication made sharper than ever. For a moment, the Mongol Empire breathed with renewed discipline, as though a wandering giant had finally remembered its own spine. Yet this clarity came with a cost. The Khan's intensity strained relationships among relatives who preferred softer boundaries and richer privileges. His audits, unbiased and merciless, created quiet resentments in every corner of the empire. And still he pressed on, convinced that only firm control could hold together realms filled with clashing cultures and competing ambitions. Then Möngke rode to China to command a campaign personally, determined to break the Song dynasty. The war dragged on, slow and grinding, far from the swift victories that once defined Mongol warfare. In the humid heat, disease spread through the camps. Möngke fell ill, and in a moment that barely stirred the air, he died. The catastrophe was silent. No explosion of rebellion, no dramatic collapse, just a sudden void where the empire's last stabilizing force had stood. His death removed the final beam holding the structure together. With no clear successor, rival branches of the family began preparing their claims. From Möngke's quiet passing rose a storm of ambition and rivalry, the greatest conflict the Mongol leadership had ever faced, one that would tear the empire from within before any enemy could. After Möngke's quiet death, the empire paused as if the wind itself waited to hear which direction history would turn. Two brothers stepped forward, not out of ambition alone, but because each carried a different vision of what the Mongol world should become. Kublai, already immersed in Chinese governance and the rhythms of settled kingdoms, believed the empire must evolve to rule the world it had absorbed. Arikboke, shaped by the open steppe and the traditions of his ancestors, believed survival lay in preserving the old ways. Their conflict was not a simple struggle for power. It was a collision between futures, each as compelling as the other. Campfires glowed dimly across divided camps, their smoke rising into cold night air as messengers rode back and forth bearing offers, warnings, and accusations. Snow settled over the steppe like a thin layer of ash, muffling hoofbeats and sharpening the sense of inevitability. Each side claimed legitimacy. Each believed the empire's soul rested in their hands. Soldiers who had once ridden together under the same banners now waited in separate fields, uncertain whether the next sunrise would bring reconciliation or war. Kublai commanded resources from the wealthy lands of China, drawing scholars, artisans, and administrators to his cause. He imagined a Mongol empire that blended cultures, built cities, and anchored its power in stability rather than perpetual motion. Arik Buk drew strength from the heart of the steppe, where loyalty to tradition ran deeper than any foreign alliance. He envisioned a world where the Mongols remained untethered, guided by the winds and the old laws. Their war unfolded slowly, marked not by grand battles alone but by starvation, shifting allegiances, and the quiet erosion of unity. It was a conflict that wounded the empire more deeply than any external enemy ever had. In the end, Kublai emerged victorious, though victory felt strangely hollow. He had won the throne, but the empire he inherited was no longer whole. The steppe and the cities had chosen different destinies, and even a Khan could not fuse them back together. Yet from this fracture, a new world began to take shape. Kublai would go on to craft the final great Mongol civilization, one unlike anything the steppe had known before ushering in the era that would define his legacy and alter the shape of Asia forever. Kublai Khan entered history as a man standing between two worlds, each demanding a different version of him. Born on the steppe, he learned the language of wind and open horizons, the rhythm of hooves, the simplicity of tents that rose and fell with the seasons. Yet as his power expanded, he found himself drawn toward the grandeur of Chinese civilization, its scholars, its rituals, its cities that glittered like constellations pressed against the earth. In time, he made a choice that reshaped the Mongol world. He stepped off the grasslands and into a palace. He built a capital Kumbalik, later known as Beijing, an immense, ordered landscape of walls, gates, and ceremonial halls. Within those walls, he styled himself not only as a Khan, but as an emperor, a ruler standing at the center of a civilization older than anything the steppe had ever held. He adopted Chinese court traditions, welcomed Confucian scholars, and surrounded himself with administrators whose knowledge stretched back centuries. His empire no longer drifted with the seasons. It rooted itself into stone. This transformation carried both brilliance and quiet sorrow. Kublai sought to merge the fluid strength of his nomadic heritage with the deep stability of the Chinese state. He imagined himself as the bridge between cultures, the ruler who could fuse the steppe's freedom with the palace's order. But each step toward imperial grandeur pulled him further from the world that had shaped him. His court grew luxurious. His officials grew numerous. The simple clarity of steppe life dissolved into the complex machinery of bureaucracy. Many Mongols felt uneasy, sensing that their traditions were fading beneath silk robes and ceremonial drums. Kublai's new identity, though powerful, carried a fragile paradox. The more he embraced the empire he governed, the more distant he became from the people who had once followed him unquestioningly. Yet he pressed onward, convinced that greatness required transformation. Kublai Khan became the first true emperor of a Mongol Chinese dynasty, ruling a world his ancestors never imagined. His reign marked not only a continuation of Mongol power, but its quiet metamorphosis into something new, majestic, vast, and undeniably changed. From this shifting identity emerged ambition on an imperial scale. And as Kublai settled into his throne, he began to envision projects grand enough to reshape not just lands, but the very fabric of the known world. Kublai Khan ruled an empire built by riders, yet he found himself dreaming in the language of architects. Where his ancestors saw open plains, he saw foundations. Where they followed the rhythm of migrating herds, he imagined roads that refused to move. And so he began to build cities of silk and stone rising where the steppe had once stretched unbroken. These were not simple settlements. They were declarations, attempts to anchor the restless spirit of the Mongol world into something permanent, ordered, and unmistakably imperial. He expanded Kumbalik into a city vast enough to swallow the horizon, its straight roads and towering gates reflecting a vision of stability that contrasted sharply with the drifting camps of the steppe. Palaces shimmered with imported artistry, markets filled with foreign merchants, Bureaucratic halls buzzed with scribes who tracked the empire's pulse through carefully inked lines rather than galloping hooves. Kublai strengthened the Grand Canal, improving the arteries through which grain and goods flowed northward. He repaired ancient roads and built new ones, stitching his territories together with deliberate precision. Yet beneath this ambition lay something quieter, a longing for permanence in a world his ancestors insisted should never stand still. Cities, in his mind, were anchors strong enough to hold an empire that had begun to drift. Canals tamed the movement of rivers. Administrative systems tamed the movement of people. Everything he built hinted at his desire to shape the world into a structure that could endure beyond war, beyond succession, beyond the uncertainty that had haunted Mongol politics since Genghis's death. But every stone he placed carried a subtle consequence. As Kublai embraced the settled world, the distance between him and the steppe widened. Traditional Mongol nobles watched these grand projects with unease, sensing their authority slipping into the hands of scholars, merchants, and administrators. The rhythm of hooves faded beneath the rhythm of construction. The empire that once lived through motion now breathed through walls, gates, and offices. And in that transformation, something essential began to unravel. Kublai's projects fortified China, enriched trade, and stabilized rule. Yet they also deepened the divide between past and present, between an empire born from wind and one shaped by stone. From these monumental works, half triumph, half quiet fracture, emerged Kublai's final ambition, expansion beyond China's borders, one last attempt to extend an empire already shifting beneath his feet. Kublai Khan, seated upon the throne of the most expansive empire on earth, believed that one final surge of conquest could complete the vision his ancestors had ignited. He looked toward the edges of the known world, toward islands wrapped in mist and jungles thick enough to swallow sound, and imagined Mongol banners rising above them. Yet the lands he now faced were nothing like the open steppe. They were dense, humid, and unpredictable, shaped not by the wind but by storms, mountains, and seas that followed their own ancient laws. Japan, distant and enigmatic, became his first great challenge. Fleets assembled with unprecedented scale, their hulls packed with soldiers accustomed to the firm soil of continents. As they crossed the sea, dark clouds formed on the horizon. Winds rose with a suddenness that felt almost sentient. The typhoon that struck tore ships apart like dry leaves, scattering them across waves that swallowed wood, armor, and ambition alike. Survivors spoke of skies that roared, as if the heavens themselves had intervened. A second invasion years later met the same fate. Nature, not warriors, defended the islands. In Southeast Asia, the Mongols found a different kind of resistance. Their armies moved into jungles where humidity clung to skin like a second layer, where insects carried unseen illnesses, and where the terrain twisted into labyrinths of vines and shadows. Horses, so vital to Mongol strategy, struggled in the deep mud. Arrows warped in the moisture. Soldiers grew sick, their strength siphoned away by a climate that resisted mastery. Battles dissolved not from defeat, but from exhaustion, disease, and disorientation. The open plains had once made the Mongols feel at home invincible, fluid, unstoppable. But here, in these dense and unfamiliar landscapes, their rhythm faltered, movements grew slow. Communication tangled, formations broke apart as if the jungle itself pushed between them. Victories, when won, felt hollow. Losses carried the weight of something larger than tactical missteps. It was as though the world had begun to articulate its limits, whispering that even the greatest empire must eventually meet resistance it cannot overcome. These failed campaigns marked the beginning of a quieter twilight. Kublai's dreams stretched far, but the earth reached further. Storms, sickness, and distance formed a boundary no army could cross. As the empire's edges crumbled beneath forces no sword could strike, its heart began to slow. And in that slowing, the long dusk of Mongol power approached. In his final years, Kublai Khan lived inside a world that grew quieter, even as it grew heavier. The empire he commanded still stretched across deserts, mountains, and river valleys. But the threads binding it together had begun to loosen. Victories no longer came with the old certainty. Messages arrived with troubling news, rebellions simmering at the margins, governors bending rules for personal gain, treasuries straining under the cost of endless projects. And as the empire drifted, So did Kublai himself, a ruler surrounded by palaces yet haunted by absence. Grief pressed deepest into his heart. The deaths of his wife Chabi and his favoured son Genghis hollowed something inside him that no ceremony or council could repair. He withdrew from court more often, lingering in chambers heavy with silence. The man who had once balanced steppe instincts with imperial vision now moved with the slow, thoughtful motions of someone carrying too much memory. His appetite grew food, drink, distraction though. Each indulgence seemed only to deepen the weight he carried. Rebellions ignited across China, their sparks catching on dry political ground. The wealthy Yuan court, layered with administrators and rituals, struggled to respond with the agility the Mongols once embodied. Armies moved slower. Orders tangled. The vast machinery that had once felt alive began to creak like an aging structure held together by habit more than strength. Kublai could feel it, though he rarely spoke of it. An empire built on motion had grown still, and stillness was a kind of suffocation. The connection to the steppe, once the beating heart of Mongol identity, faded into a distant memory. The old nobles looked at the court with uneasy eyes, seeing silk where there should have been felt, ceremony where there should have been instinct. The empire's transformation, once Kublai's proud ambition, now resembled a widening gulf between past and present. Yet the end did not arrive through catastrophe. It came softly, like the slow dimming of a lantern at dusk. Kublai, aging and burdened, watched the world change around him until the boundaries of his rule felt blurred and fragile. When he died in 1294, the empire did not collapse outright. It simply sighed, exhaling a long breath held through decades of ambition and strain. And from this fading light, we move into the final chapters. What remains after the greatest empire dissolves, and how its echoes continue long after the riders disappear into the night. The fall of the Mongol Empire is often described as a collapse, swift, dramatic, the breaking of a vast structure under its own weight. But the truth is quieter, more elusive. Politically, the four great khanates drifted apart, their alliances thinning, their borders dissolving into the shifting sands of time. Yet the empire did not truly disappear. It changed shape. It became something less visible, more enduring, a ghost woven into the systems and memories of the world it once ruled. Long after the last Khan lost authority, the Mongols remained present in the way people traded, travelled, governed, and even imagined distance. Their influence sank deep into Persia, where administrative practices refined under Mongol rule shaped later dynasties. In China, the Yuan legacy left marks on bureaucracy, road systems, and intercultural networks. In Russia, Mongol political structures, tribute routes, military organization, centralized authority continued long after the Golden Horde vanished. Even Europe, which fought the Mongols at its borders, absorbed their methods: faster communication, diplomatic passports, and a new awareness of the vast world beyond its own fragmented kingdoms. The Mongols had unintentionally laid the foundations for early globalization. The Silk Roads they revived did not disappear when their empire fractured. The routes continued to pulse with caravans carrying ideas, goods, religions, and rumors. Their insistence on protecting merchants became a tradition other states adopted. Their policy of religious tolerance influenced regions long after their departure, showing rulers that diversity could stabilize rather than undermine. Their relay communication system, the YAM, echoed through later postal networks, becoming the ancestor of systems that carried news across nations. What lingered most, however, was psychological. The Mongols had shown the world that continents were not separate realms, but parts of a connected whole. Kingdoms, once isolated from each other, now understood themselves as pieces of a larger map. Travelers followed paths the Mongols had carved. Scholars exchanged knowledge across cultures once divided by suspicion, and entire civilizations felt the faint rhythm of an empire that no longer existed, yet continued to guide movement and thought. The Mongol Empire lived on as an afterimage, its body gone, its spirit diffused into the world it reshaped. Its traces lay in laws, roads, borders, and beliefs, subtle but undeniable. From this enduring afterlife, we step into an even stranger legacy: how the Mongols shaped the rise of powers that would dominate the centuries after them. When the Mongol Empire fractured, it did not vanish. It drifted outward, carried by the peoples who stepped into its place. Each successor realm, Golden Horde, Chagatai Khanate, Ilkhanate, Persia, and the remnants of the Yuan in China held fragments of the old order woven into their foundations. They did not preserve the empire as it had been, but absorbed its habits, systems, and instincts until Mongol ideas became indistinguishable from their own. Across the northern plains, the Golden Horde shaped the destiny of Russia. Princes who once resisted Mongol rule adopted Mongol taxation models, census-taking, and centralized authority. Muscovite rulers learned from their former overlords how to gather tribute, expand borders, and wield power through a firm hierarchy. Even after the horde dissolved, Russia carried its imprint governed by shadows of steppe politics long after Mongol banners disappeared. Farther south, in the lands of Persia, the Ilkhanate faded into local dynasties, yet Mongol influence remained in quieter ways. Administrative reforms, religious tolerance, and trade protections lived on, carried forward by courts that blended Persian sophistication with Mongol pragmatism. Cities once rebuilt under Mongol supervision retained their cosmopolitan character, becoming crossroads where scholars, merchants, and travelers continued to mingle. In Central Asia, the Chagatai realm evolved into a shifting tapestry of Turkic and Persian cultures, each inheriting fragments of Mongol military organization and steppe mobility. Cavalry traditions, sharpened by generations of nomadic warfare, fed into the future armies of the Timurids and later empires. The Mongol way of war, fluid, fast, deceptive, left fingerprints on strategies that would echo for centuries. Even in China, where the Yuan dynasty fell and native rule returned, traces remained. Administrative structures, postal routes, and multicultural court practices continued to influence governance. Markets once open to the broader world remained vibrant arteries of exchange. The Mongols themselves faded, but the world they had connected stayed connected. The Ottomans, rising in the west, absorbed steppe cavalry tactics and statecraft inherited indirectly from Mongol and Turkic traditions. Silk Road cities, once garrisoned by Mongol overseers, preserved administrative rhythms that shaped how merchants and officials interacted for generations. The empire did not end, it scattered. Its pieces embedded themselves across continents, dissolving into cultures that believed themselves separate, yet carried quiet inheritances of steppe logic. From these inheritors, each shaped by Mongol echoes, we moved toward the transformations that rippled across continents, changes that redefined trade, warfare, and the shape of the world itself. The Mongol conquests shattered boundaries that had stood for centuries. Their riders tore open the seams between civilizations, and through those new openings flowed more than armies. Ideas, technologies, and diseases slipped across continents with a speed the world had never experienced. The Mongols did not intend to reshape global history. They simply moved through it with such force that everything around them began to shift. The old world, once divided into isolated spheres, suddenly found itself part of a single, trembling system. Caravans no longer stopped at borders, they crossed them. Scholars traveled farther than their ancestors believed possible, carrying mathematics from Persia into China and astronomical knowledge from the Islamic world into Europe. Gunpowder secrets drifted westward, first whispered, then traded, then adopted by kingdoms that barely knew the Mongols, except as distant threats. Printing techniques that had matured in China moved slowly toward Europe, carried by merchants whose roots had reopened under Mongol protection. But not every exchange brought advantage. Along these same pathways, diseases traveled with terrifying efficiency. The Black Death, which would carve a deep scar across Europe, found acceleration in the very networks the Mongols strengthened. Fleas on rodents followed merchant caravans, moving from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, with a speed unthinkable before Mongol rule. The plague was not created by the empire, yet its spread traced the arteries they revived. In a tragic inversion, the same roads that carried silk and wisdom also carried death. Still, the world that emerged from these exchanges was fundamentally changed. Kingdoms learned that their fates were linked to lands far beyond their borders. Navigators gained fragments of geographic knowledge that later inspired voyages across oceans. Diplomats discovered new routes of communication. A global consciousness, fragile, unformed, but real, began to flicker through the old world. The Mongols had not set out to ignite the modern era, yet their movement collapsed distances, merged cultures, and forced civilizations to see one another not as distant myths but as neighbors. Their empire broke apart, but the chain reaction they triggered continued. Walls, both physical and mental, fell. Curiosity widened, exchange intensified. What remained after their passing was a world pushed into motion, a world that could no longer retreat into its old separations. And from this vast, unintended transformation, the story narrows again, shifting from global echoes to the memory of the riders themselves, and the shadows they left on the human imagination. Long after the Mongol Empire dissolved, the riders continued their journey no longer across plains or mountains, but through imagination. They became figures cast in the shifting light of memory, reshaped with every retelling. Travelers spoke of them in voices tinged with fear or admiration, depending on which stories reached their shores. To some, the Mongols were monsters who arrived like storms, devouring everything in their path. To others, they were heroes who brought order to lands divided by endless conflict. And to many, they were ghosts, silent, swift, impossible to grasp fully. Medieval European scribes described them as creatures of the apocalypse, horsemen born from prophecy rather than earth. Their speed felt supernatural, their discipline otherworldly. Rumors claimed they drank the blood of their horses, spoke with spirits, or could ride for days without rest. These legends said more about the anxieties of the people telling them than about the Mongols themselves. Yet the myths endured, gaining a life independent of truth. In Persia and Central Asia, stories carried a more complex tone. Poets wrote of Mongol rulers who destroyed cities yet rebuilt them grander than before. Chronicles recorded both brutality and justice, leaving future generations to debate which face of the empire was real. Some families preserved tales of ancestors who served Mongol courts, rising in status through merit rather than birth. Others whispered about lost villages, their memories fading like footprints erased by wind. In China, the Mongols became woven into the long tapestry of dynasties, remembered as both foreigners and shapers of history. Their rulers appeared in theatre plays, novels, and folk songs, sometimes as tyrants, sometimes as wise kings. Over time, the edges of reality softened, leaving behind silhouettes filled with contradiction and wonder. Across the steppe itself, the memory remained closest to truth. Elders spoke of the riders not as demons or saints, but as people forged by hardship and horizon. Their legacy lived in the quiet pride of nomadic families, in the rhythm of horses galloping across open fields, and in the understanding that the world once moved differently, faster, wider, with a clarity born from motion. The Mongols no longer inspire terror, they inspire curiosity. Their image has grown larger than life, not because they sought myth, but because the world needed myth to explain what it could not fully understand. And from these lingering echoes, we step into the final chapter, the greatest hidden truth behind the empire that reshaped the world. Beneath the armor, beneath the horses, beneath the spectacle of conquest, the Mongols carried something far more human than legend suggests. Their victories did not begin with ambition. They began with fear of hunger, of betrayal, of winter winds sharp enough to strip the warmth from a child's bones. Long before they conquered kingdoms, they learned to survive a land that offered no kindness. Hardship carved unity into them, the way rivers carve stone, slowly, relentlessly, shaping a people who understood that stillness was a kind of death. The steppe did not allow complacency. It demanded constant movement, constant attention, constant adaptation. From this unforgiving world grew leaders who were not chosen because of lineage alone, but because they listened, decided, and endured. Temüjin, later Genghis Khan, rose not through inherited power, but through the trust of men who had watched him suffer and survive. Loyalty in the Mongol world was not abstract. It was earned by sharing hunger, danger, and the cold. It was held together by the knowledge that a single mistake could cost an entire family or clan its future. Their victories, often portrayed as acts of ruthless domination, were rooted in that shared memory of fragility. The Mongols moved quickly because they had learned what happened to those who moved too slowly. They struck hard because hesitation on the steppe meant losing everything. Even their discipline sprang from necessity, an instinct to rely on one another because the land alone could not be relied upon. This perspective complicates the myth of the Mongols as purely destructive forces. They were not mindless warriors chasing glory. They were survivors who believed the world beyond the steppe was no different from the one they had grown up in. Unpredictable, scarce, and filled with threats that had to be managed before they grew uncontrollable. When they conquered, They did so with the conviction that control was the only path to security, that motion was safety, and that unity was the only shield capable of withstanding the storms of fate. Seen from this angle, the Mongol Empire becomes less a story of conquest and more a story of trauma transformed into momentum. Their strength came from a deep understanding of vulnerability, their unity from shared wounds, their strategies from a lifetime of confronting fear rather than fleeing it. And from these psychological roots, the narrative now turns towards something deeper still, the philosophy that shaped how the Mongols saw life, death, and their place beneath the endless sky. To understand the Mongols, one must look upward, not at banners or arrows, but at the sky and endless blue roof that shaped their philosophy long before it shaped their empire. On the steppe, nothing was permanent. Camps rose and vanished with the seasons. Horses galloped across horizons with no borders to stop them. The land offered no walls, no fixed boundaries, no sense of lasting shelter. And from this restless world emerged a worldview built on impermanence, motion, and the quiet conviction that hesitation was more dangerous than any enemy. To the Mongols, stillness felt unnatural. Life flowed best when in motion, riding, adapting, responding to the shifting moods of weather, grass, and fate. They grew up knowing that change was not something to fear. It was the core rhythm of existence. A child learned early that the world belonged not to those who clung to a place, but to those who dared to move through it. Where city-bound civilizations sought stability through walls and permanence, the Mongols sought clarity in open space, believing freedom was strongest where nothing could contain it. This philosophy seeped into everything they built. Their empire was vast, yet it refused to settle into one cultural mold. It stretched across continents, yet remained strangely weightless, held together by movement rather than monuments. Their leaders understood that permanence breeds complacency, and complacency courts ruin. So they leaned into the wisdom the steppe had given them. Act before danger grows, shift before stagnation spreads, trust motion more than structure. But as their empire expanded, this philosophy confronted its greatest paradox. Power requires roots, courts, officials, records, cities, and the Mongols, in embracing these tools, began losing the very freedom that had carried them to greatness. Their children inherited palaces instead of pastures. Their armies learned to defend borders instead of outrunning them. Their rulers listened to bureaucrats instead of wind. And slowly, almost invisibly, the philosophy of the open sky dimmed beneath the weight of administration. The Mongols were bold enough to take the world, yet their worldview was never built to hold it. They lived as if everything was temporary, and so their empire became temporary too. A vast, brilliant flash of motion, passing across history like a comet. From this philosophy, shaped by horizon and wind, rises the final revelation, the meaning behind the empire's rise and fall, and why its story still whispers across the world today. The fall of the Mongol Empire is often described as a failure, a slow unraveling across continents. But viewed through a quieter lens, its collapse feels less like ruin and more like release an exhaled breath after a storm has spent its fury. The Mongols reshaped the world with such force that, once the transformation was complete, the empire's purpose subtly dissolved. What remained was not an unfinished project, but a completed one. Their rise had been driven by necessity. Scattered tribes seeking security, hungry families searching for stability, riders moving across grasslands because motion was the only shield they had ever known. Conquest was not an obsession, but a solution, an answer to the threats that shadowed them. And for a time, the empire served that purpose flawlessly. It connected lands that had long existed as strangers. It revived trade routes, merged technologies, and unraveled ancient boundaries. It made the world smaller, faster, more aware of itself. But once that world had opened, the steppe's old logic began to fade. There were no more bottlenecks to break, no more closed doors to force open, no more forgotten corners untouched by exchange. The great currents of commerce, culture, and communication flowed freely without needing Mongol riders to clear the way. The empire had done its work so thoroughly that it became unnecessary even to itself. In many ways, the Mongols succeeded too completely. Their own children inherited lands that no longer required the relentless motion that had forged their ancestors. Courts replaced camps. Administrators replaced captains. Stillness crept back in the stillness the steppe had taught them to fear. The empire had risen through speed and unity, but maintenance demanded the opposite: stability, bureaucracy, patience. And so the Mongols drifted into a paradox. To preserve their achievements, they needed to become something other than Mongols. Few could make that transformation without losing the essence of who they were. This is why their empire feels different from others. It did not fall because it was broken. It fell because it had already completed its trajectory, like a comet burning bright, illuminating everything around it, then quietly fading once its path was fulfilled. The Mongols were never meant to rule forever. They were meant to move, to connect, to ignite the world into motion. And from this understanding, the story settles into its final reflection, the quiet meaning left behind, once the riders have disappeared over the horizon. In the end, the Mongols do not vanish. They simply grow distant, as if riding toward a horizon that forever retreats but never disappears. History records their battles, their cities taken, their routes carved across continents, yet the final image they leave behind is quieter. It is not the roar of conquest, but the gentle rhythm of hooves moving through tall grass at dusk. The empire fades, but the riders remain silhouettes against a fading sky, carrying with them a story shaped more by motion than by blood. As they recede, the world they reshaped settles into its new form. Roads they protected continue to wind across deserts. Cities they influenced grow into vibrant centers of culture and trade. Ideas they spread take root in distant lands. Long after their banners fall, their presence lingers in the way people travel, communicate, and imagine the world. It is as if the Mongols stretched the boundaries of possibility, leaving behind a wider horizon for everyone who followed. Their legacy is not found in monuments, for they built few. It lives in the spaces between things, in the sudden closeness of distant cultures, in the shared knowledge of continents once kept apart, in the quiet understanding that the world is bigger and smaller than it once seemed. Their empire rose and fell within a heartbeat of history, yet its echoes hum beneath the surface of modern life like a low, steady wind. And still, when night deepens and the mind grows still, something of the steppe returns, a sense of openness, a feeling of breathless possibility, a reminder that motion can be a form of clarity, and that the world's most powerful forces often leave the lightest footprints. The Mongols, who lived without walls, remind us gently that everything nations, empires, even stories moves in cycles of rise and ebb, appearance and fading. So the riders drift into the horizon, neither heroes nor villains, but wanderers whose paths brushed against the shape of the world and subtly altered its course. Their story ends not with a crash, but with a long, soft exhale, a settling of dust, a dimming of light, a memory carried forward by those who pause to listen. And if you listen closely enough, in the quiet tide of night, you might still hear the faint echo of hooves carrying their story onward into the dark.